Do you remember when dining out was more than just food? It was velvet booths, chandeliers, and a little bit of magic? In the 1970s, restaurants weren't just places to eat. They were stages where Hollywood stars, Wall Street tycoons, and everyday dreamers soaked in the glamour. Some of those legendary dining rooms are long gone now, but their stories still sparkle like champagne on white linen. Today, we're taking you back to 30 luxurious 1970s restaurants that are gone forever but never forgotten. La Scala, Beverly Hills. In the glittering landscape of Beverly Hills dining, La Scala wasn't just a restaurant, it was a scene. Founded by Gene Leon in the 1950s, by the time the 1970s rolled around, it had solidified its reputation as the place where old Hollywood rubbed elbows with the rising stars of new Hollywood. Imagine a dimly lit dining room, crisp white tablecloths, and a hush of anticipation as you scan the room, not for the waiter with your martini, but for the celebrity you might recognize 2 tables over. Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, and Natalie Wood weren't occasional guests. They were regular fixtures. La Scala's pasta dishes, especially its chopped salad and hearty lasagna, became nearly as famous as the actors who devoured them after a film premiere or a long night of shooting. But La Scala was more than just celebrity sightings. It offered a sense of continuity during a decade of social and cultural upheaval. The 1970s were about disco balls, gas shortages, and Watergate. But inside La Scala's walls, the focus was on conversation, indulgence, and a plate of rigatone, cooked exactly as it had been 20 years earlier. In that way, the restaurant was a time capsule of glamour, predictable, yes, but gloriously so. For families and hopeful dreamers, dining at La Scala meant brushing shoulders with greatness, if only for an evening. Parents would whisper to their children, "That's Frank Sinatra," and the memory would stick for decades. Today, with celebrity culture diffused across Instagram stories and private clubs, the magic feels different. La Scala still exists in name, but the aura of the 1970s, the hush, the exclusivity, the sense that your dinner was a front row ticket to Hollywood, has vanished. Dining out now may be easier, faster, trendier, but it rarely feels that cinematic. Sardi's, New York City. If Broadway had an official dining room, it was Sardi's. Tucked into the heart of Manhattan's theater district, Sardi's was less about what was on the plate and more about who was in the room. Since opening in 1927, the restaurant had become a tradition for actors, critics, and hopefuls. But in the 1970s, it reached a level of cultural saturation that was almost mythic. You couldn't talk about Broadway without talking about Sardi's. Its walls, lined with hundreds of celebrity caricatures, were more than decoration. They were a map of show business itself. To be sketched and hung among the portraits was a rite of passage, the kind of immortality most performers dreamed of. The food was classic continental fare. Think shrimp cocktail, roast prime rib, and bananas Foster. But nobody went to Sardi's just for dinner. This was the place to catch the theater gossip before opening night, or to nervously await the next day's reviews over a stiff martini. Producers sealed deals at the corner tables. Critics could be spotted scribbling notes, and understudies dared to hope for a glance of recognition from the industry's power players. The atmosphere carried a mix of nervous energy and starstruck awe, as if the entire dining room was perpetually waiting for the curtain to rise. For New Yorkers and out-of-towners alike, dining at Sardi's in the 1970s was part of the Broadway experience, like buying a playbill or humming a show tune on the subway ride home. Today, the restaurant still stands, but its golden age of theatrical dominance has passed. What was once the beating heart of Broadway now feels more like a charming relic. Yet in memory, Sardi's remains timeless, a place where theater history was written not only on stage, but over dinner and drinks just a block away. El Morocco, New York City. If Studio 54 was the wild child of New York nightlife, El Morocco was its older, impeccably dressed sibling. By the 1970s, this legendary club restaurant had already been the crown jewel of Manhattan society for decades. And though its heyday had begun in the 1930s, the zebra-striped banquettes and velvet ropes were still pulling in celebrities, socialites, and anyone desperate to be seen. El Morocco was more than a place to eat or dance. It was a stage, and everyone who stepped inside knew they were part of the performance. The trick was simply to get past the door. The decor was iconic, those bold zebra stripes that turned every candid photograph into instant tabloid fodder. Paparazzi lived for it, because a picture at El Morocco didn't just say you were out, it said you were important. Elizabeth Taylor, Andy Warhol, Truman Capote, and the jet set of the 1970s all made their rounds here. The menu? Almost secondary. Sure, you could order a rich steak dinner or sip champagne into the night, but nobody was showing up for the cuisine. El Morocco was about the spectacle, the social ladder climbing, and the possibility that you might dance the night away next to royalty or Hollywood's brightest star. In an era when America was grappling with recession, gas lines, and shifting cultural values, El Morocco offered escape. It was old world glamour stubbornly holding its ground against a city that was changing fast. By the late 1970s, however, its magic was fading. New nightlife spots were stealing its thunder, and the exclusivity that once felt magnetic started to feel dated. Today, El Morocco lives on mostly in black and white photographs and wistful anecdotes. It may be gone, but its zebra-striped legacy is forever stitched into the fabric of New York's glittering past. Ma Maison, Los Angeles. Long before the word foodie crept into our vocabulary, Los Angeles had Ma Maison. Opened in the early 1970s, this cozy, unassuming restaurant on Melrose Avenue didn't look like much from the outside. It was tucked behind a vine-covered fence and carried the air of a hidden neighborhood bistro. But once you stepped through the gate, you were in the middle of Hollywood's most exclusive dining scene. Ma Maison was intimate, romantic, and effortlessly chic, the kind of place where a director might sketch notes on a napkin while Meryl Streep or Jack Nicholson savored dinner 2 tables away. The food was the real revelation. Under the guidance of a young Austrian chef named Wolfgang Puck, Ma Maison introduced Angelenos to a new style of French-inspired cuisine that was lighter, fresher, and more playful than the heavy continental menus that dominated the time. Diners swooned over smoked salmon pizzas, delicate pâtés, and beautifully plated dishes that looked like art. In many ways, Puck's work at Ma Maison helped redefine what fine dining in America could be, moving it toward the innovative, California fresh style we still see today. Yet, Ma Maison wasn't only about the food, it was about belonging. Getting a reservation felt like joining a secret club, and the dining room's buzz came not from loud music, but from whispered gossip and clinking glasses of white burgundy. For celebrities, it was both sanctuary and stage. For ordinary diners lucky enough to score a table, it was a brush with stardom. By the 1980s, Ma Maison's reign began to fade, and eventually it closed, but its legacy is massive. Without this little garden bistro, we might never have seen Wolfgang Puck rise to fame, and the very idea of California cuisine might have taken a different path. Ma Maison may be gone, but its influence still flavors every stylish plate of modern fine dining. L'Escoffier Room, Savoy Plaza Hotel, New York City. In the pantheon of New York fine dining, few places carried the aura of refinement quite like the L'Escoffier Room at the Savoy Plaza Hotel. Named for Auguste Escoffier, the French culinary master who codified haute cuisine, this dining room was conceived as both a tribute and a standard bearer. By the 1970s, it stood as one of the last true temples of old world dining in Manhattan, where the meal was less about speed or novelty and more about ritual. Stepping into the L'Escoffier Room was like entering another era. Crystal chandeliers chandeliers overhead, hush service from tuxedoed waiters, and a menu that read like a love letter to French tradition. The dishes were as classic as they come: sole Veronique, duck à l'orange, and grand soufflés that seemed to rise with theatrical timing. Every detail reinforced the sense of ceremony. Even the way sauces were ladled tableside felt like part of the performance. For diners weary of the city's grit and noise in the 1970s, this was a sanctuary of civility, a place where you could sip champagne and pretend for a few hours that the outside world didn't exist. But the very qualities that made the L'Escoffier room legendary also made it vulnerable. As American taste shifted toward casual dining, international flavors, and the energy of newer restaurants, the stately old-world elegance began to feel out of step. The Savoy Plaza itself was demolished in 1965 to make way for the General Motors building, but its L'Escoffier room lived on in memory throughout the decade as a symbol of the grandeur New York once offered. Today, it's remembered less for a specific dish than for the experience it embodied, an era when fine dining meant dressing up, dining slowly, and surrendering to the romance of French cuisine at its most polished. Lutèce, New York City. If there was one restaurant in New York during the 1970s that embodied culinary perfection, it was Lutèce. Tucked away on East 51st Street, this unpretentious townhouse was the domain of Chef André Soltner, who became both legend and guardian of French haute cuisine in America. There was no neon sign, no velvet rope, no paparazzi stationed outside. Lutèce didn't need them. Its reputation alone kept a months-long waiting list, drawing not just celebrities, but also diplomats, writers, and discerning gourmands who wanted a taste of Paris without leaving Manhattan. The magic of Lutèce was in its restraint. Soltner was famous for never missing a day in his kitchen, decades without a vacation, constantly present at the stove. His food wasn't about flashy trends or gimmicks, but about precision and elegance. Quenelles of pike and lobster sauce, foie gras terrine, delicate soufflés, and vegetables treated with reverence. In a decade when many restaurants were trying to dazzle with disco-era extravagance, Lutèce was refreshingly timeless. The dining room, with its lace curtains, fresh flowers, and understated charm, felt more like a private salon than a stage for social climbing. For those lucky enough to secure a reservation, eating at Lutèce was transformative. It was where anniversaries were celebrated, careers toasted, and visiting dignitaries impressed. To step inside was to step into Soltner's vision of what fine dining should be: gracious, flawless, and deeply personal. By the late 20th century, as nouvelle cuisine and fusion flavors began to reshape the dining world, Lutèce remained a bastion of tradition. Its decline in the 1990s marked not just the end of a restaurant, but the end of an era in American gastronomy. In memory, though, Lutèce lives on as the gold standard, the restaurant against which all others in the 1970s were measured. Mama Leone's, New York City. Few restaurants in New York City loomed as large in memory, or in square footage, as Mama Leone's. Opened in 1906 by Luisa Mama Leone, this sprawling Italian institution had, by the 1970s, become a rite of passage for tourists and locals alike. It wasn't fine dining in the Lutèce sense, but it didn't have to be. Mama Leone's promised abundance, long communal tables, heaping platters of pasta, pitchers of Chianti, and enough breadsticks to keep the kids happy while the adults toasted. By the height of its popularity, it seated more than 1,000 diners a night, and the restaurant's labyrinth of dining rooms felt almost like a small village within Manhattan. The menu was unapologetically hearty: spaghetti with meatballs, lasagna bubbling with cheese, veal parmigiana, cannoli, everything Everything arrived in portions that suggested the kitchen never quite believed you were full. The atmosphere matched: boisterous, noisy, celebratory. Families came in droves. Broadway theater goers stopped by before a show, and out-of-towners left with the impression that they had tasted authentic Italian America, even if the real thing was a bit more nuanced. For many, Mama Leone's was less about culinary accuracy and more about the fantasy of Italy brought to life in New York. By the 1970s, the restaurant was a tourist magnet, sometimes to its own detriment. Locals who once cherished it began to see it as kitsch, and food critics were quick to dismiss the heavy, old-fashioned fare. But none of that dulled the enthusiasm of the crowds who filled its dining rooms night after night. In time, as tastes shifted and real estate prices soared, Mama Leone's closed, leaving only memories and a few faded postcards in its place. Today, its legacy survives as a symbol of abundance, hospitality, and the era when dining out in New York meant a plate of pasta bigger than your head and a story you'd tell for years. The Gaslight Club, Chicago and beyond. If you were looking for a night out in the 1970s that blended speakeasy nostalgia with a dash of cheeky glamour, the Gaslight Club was your destination. Founded in Chicago in the 1950s by Don Quinn, by the time the disco decade rolled around, the chain had expanded into other cities, offering a heady mix of steakhouse dining and Prohibition-era theater. Guests didn't just come for the food, they came for the atmosphere, where flapper-style gaslight girls served cocktails and dinner in corsets and feathered headpieces, as ragtime tunes tinkled from a player piano. The clubs evoked the roaring 20s with a wink, perfect for a generation living through Vietnam protests, Watergate, and social upheaval, but eager for some playful escapism. The menu itself leaned hearty and traditional: prime rib carved tableside, shrimp cocktails piled high, and desserts drenched in flambéed liqueurs. It wasn't cutting-edge cuisine, but that wasn't the point. People came for the spectacle, the dimly lit ambiance with red velvet drapes and brass chandeliers, and the sense of being transported to a time when dinner was theater. Unlike the exclusivity of El Morocco or the refinement of Lutece, the Gaslight Club offered luxury with a body grin, a night out where the food was comforting, the martinis were strong, and the entertainment was as much the staff as the stage. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the novelty began to wear thin. Changing social tastes and the rise of new dining and nightlife trends pushed the Gaslight Club into decline. Still, for those who experienced it, the memory lingers. A steakhouse that doubled as a speakeasy fantasy, where glamour came with a wink and a chorus. Still, for those who experienced it, the memory lingers. A steakhouse that doubled as a speakeasy fantasy, where glamour came with a wink and a chorus of clinking champagne glasses. Today, it stands as a reminder that luxury once meant not just fine food, but the promise of being swept into a different time, if only for an evening. P.J. Clarke's upscale 1970s era NYC. By the 1970s, P.J. Clarke's wasn't just a bar, it was an institution with a surprising touch of polish. This unpretentious midtown saloon, founded way back in 1884, had earned a reputation as the Cadillac of burgers. But in the disco decade, it found itself caught between two identities: the old-school watering hole for newspapermen and musicians, and the unexpectedly chic haunt for celebrities who wanted something real in a city of ever-escalating glitz. Frank Sinatra, Jackie Onassis, and even Nat King Cole were known to pull up a chair, and Cole famously declared Clarke's bacon cheeseburger to be the very best. In a time when Manhattan dining was shifting toward French refinement at Lutece, or the spectacle of windows on the world, P.J. Clarke's offered something almost radical: comfort. The food was simple, but in its simplicity lay the appeal. burgers served on wax paper with pickles, crisp onion rings, raw oysters, and strong drinks mixed at the bar. It was a place where the menu didn't need reinvention. Yet, in the 1970s, even that casual approach felt upscale, because Clark's had mastered the art of atmosphere. Dark wood paneling, stained glass, a piano in the corner, every detail whispered of a bygone New York, even as the city lurched into modern chaos. For many, dining here was an act of loyalty to the city's roots. Tourists might not have understood the hype, but New Yorkers did. Clark's was where you went after the theater, after work, after heartbreak, and sometimes after too many martinis. Today, PJ Clark's still stands, but the mystique of its 1970s heyday, when a humble hamburger joint managed to outshine the glitter of more luxurious restaurants, lives on as proof that in New York, authenticity often outlasts extravagance. Ritz Old Poodle Dog, San Francisco. By the time the 1970s arrived, San Francisco's Ritz Old Poodle Dog was already steeped in more history than most restaurants could dream of. Originally founded in the mid-1800s by French immigrants, the Poodle Dog had long been the city's most famous French dining establishment, its name both charmingly odd and oddly enduring. The Ritz iteration, reborn after the 1906 earthquake and styled with Belle Epoque elegance, carried the restaurant into the modern age while preserving its Parisian soul. Chandeliers, mirrored walls, and tuxedoed waiters gave it the air of a grand European salon, even as the city outside was becoming the heart of counterculture. In the 1970s, dining at the Ritz Old Poodle Dog was an exercise in tradition. The menu leaned heavily on French classics: escargot dripping in garlic butter, chateaubriand carved at the table, and desserts like profiteroles and soufflés that arrived with a sense of ceremony. It was the sort of place where wine lists were thick and intimidating, but the staff guided patrons with a reassuring hand. For business dinners, anniversaries, or tourists looking to taste real San Francisco sophistication, the Old Poodle Dog was a guaranteed experience. Yet that grandeur was both its strength and its weakness. As California cuisine was beginning to emerge, lighter, fresher, ingredient-driven, the Poodle Dog felt increasingly out of step. Younger diners craved Alice Waters' Chez Panisse in Berkeley, while the Ritz Old Poodle Dog seemed tethered to a more formal European definition of luxury. By the end of the 20th century, the restaurant faded away, remembered fondly by those who once sat beneath its chandeliers. Today, its name survives mostly as a curious footnote in the city's dining history. But for San Franciscans of the 1970s, a night at the Ritz Old Poodle Dog was still a chance to dine like royalty, with a side of old-world romance. Early upscale Szechuan gourmet houses, New York City and Los Angeles. In the 1970s, American dining was beginning to stretch beyond steak and potatoes, and nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of upscale Szechuan restaurants in New York and Los Angeles. Before then, Chinese food in the US was largely synonymous with chop suey parlors and Cantonese American comfort dishes. But as waves of Chinese immigrants arrived and adventurous diners began seeking bolder flavors, a new wave of restaurants introduced Szechuan cuisine, fiery, complex, and unapologetically authentic to a wider audience. These weren't hole-in-the-wall takeout counters. They were refined, sit-down establishments that treated Chinese cooking with the same seriousness Americans gave to French or Italian dining. Menus showcased dishes that shocked and delighted palates used to sweet and sour pork. Suddenly, diners were talking about mapo tofu with its numbing peppercorn heat, twice-cooked pork, sizzling dazzling hot pots, and kung pao chicken that actually had some punch. Red chilies, garlic, and ginger were no longer exotic. They were the stars of the show. And while the flavors were intense, the atmosphere was often elegant. White tablecloths, polished service, and carefully curated wine or cocktail pairings. In New York, restaurants like Uncle Ty's began introducing gourmet Chinese as a concept, while Los Angeles saw establishments that elevated regional dishes for Hollywood's adventurous elite. For many Americans in the 1970s, dining at one of these restaurants felt like stepping through a door into another world. Thrilling, sophisticated, and a little daring. The experience marked a cultural turning point, signaling that Chinese food was not just cheap takeout, but a cuisine capable of luxury and artistry. Today, with Szechuan peppercorns readily available and regional Chinese cooking celebrated nationwide, it's easy to forget how revolutionary those first upscale houses were. In their time, they were trailblazers, reshaping American palates and expanding the very definition of fine dining. The Playboy Club restaurants. In the 1970s, when the Playboy empire was at the height of its cultural power, the Playboy Club restaurants offered diners something more than dinner. They offered membership in a lifestyle. Located in major cities like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, these clubs weren't just eateries. They were social theaters where glamour, exclusivity, and a dose of cheeky decadence came together under one roof. The key to entry was the famous Playboy key card, a little metal pass that signaled not just membership, but status. Inside, the atmosphere was a blend of sleek supper club and fantasy lounge, with dim lighting, plush seating, and of course, the iconic Playboy bunnies serving food and cocktails in satin corsets and rabbit ears. On the menu, guests found hearty steakhouse classics, prime rib, shrimp cocktails, and rich desserts. Dishes designed less for culinary innovation and more for indulgence. The real draw was the performance. Bunnies balancing trays with polished ease, live music or comedy on stage, and the lingering sense that you were part of something risque yet refined. For business dinners, bachelor parties, or nights out with friends, the Playboy clubs offered a kind of luxury that was equal parts escapist fantasy and mid-century tradition. By the 1970s, however, cultural tides were shifting. Women's liberation movements criticized the clubs for objectifying their servers, while younger generations were beginning to seek out more diverse and adventurous dining scenes. The spectacle of the Playboy Club, once cutting edge, began to feel dated. Yet for a certain slice of America, these restaurants remain a symbol of their era, flashy, exclusive, and unapologetically tied to Hugh Hefner's vision of sophistication. Today, most of the original clubs are gone, but in memory, the Playboy Club restaurants are frozen in time, equal parts steakhouse, nightclub, and social experiment in turning dinner into a fantasy. Monsieur Henri, Los Angeles. In the glamorous dining landscape of 1970s Los Angeles, Monsieur Henri stood out as one of the city's most sophisticated and intimate French restaurants. Nestled in West Hollywood, this elegant spot catered to Hollywood's elite with an atmosphere that felt both cosmopolitan and discreet. A place where film producers could impress investors, actors could be seen but not mobbed, and couples could savor a candlelit dinner that seemed plucked from the boulevards of Paris. The restaurant's namesake and guiding force, Henri, embodied the charm of old-world hospitality, ensuring every guest felt like they were dining at a hidden gem rather than just another trendy LA eatery. The menu leaned unapologetically French, with a focus on timeless classics executed with care. Duck à l'orange, delicate soufflés, and veal prepared with rich reductions. Lobster thermidor, escargot, and steak au poivre often graced the tables, served with a flourish by tuxedoed waiters who carried themselves with as much gravitas as the maitre d'. For many, the experience was as much about the ritual, the hushed conversations, the polished wine service, the orchestration of a perfect evening, as it was about the food. Monsieur Henri thrived in an era when French cuisine still defined fine dining in America, especially in Hollywood, where sophistication often equaled European flair. But as California cuisine began to take root later in the decade, with its lighter dishes and farm-to-table ethos, Monsieur Henri's old-world formality began to feel out of sync with a city in transition. By the time it closed, the restaurant had already become something of a time capsule, remembered fondly by those who had celebrated anniversaries, business deals, or glittering nights out within its velvet-lined walls. Today, Monsieur Henri lives on in memory as a snapshot of a Los Angeles dining era when elegance, discretion, and French indulgence reigned supreme. Voisin, New York City. In the heart of Manhattan's mid-century dining scene, Voisin was a temple of French sophistication that carried into the 1970s with an air of timeless elegance. Originally opened in the 1940s, the restaurant became synonymous with haute cuisine in New York, a place where chandeliers sparkled, waiters glided across the floor in crisp white jackets, and the clientele spoke in hushed tones over fine wines and classic French dishes. By the time the disco decade rolled around, Voisin still embodied the grandeur of an earlier age, drawing in diplomats, publishing magnates, and society's upper crust for evenings that blended culinary mastery with social ritual. The menu was resolutely French and unapologetically luxurious. Dishes like tornadoes, rossini, Dover sole meunière, and quenelles of pike showcased both skill and tradition, while the dessert cart groaned under the weight of pastries and confections straight out of Paris. For many patrons, dinner at Voisin was not just a meal, but a declaration of status, a night when money and taste converged on linen-draped tables in the glow of candlelight. But as the 1970s wore on, New York's dining culture began to shift. Younger diners were drawn to bolder, more adventurous flavors, while the city itself was undergoing cultural upheavals that made the stiff rituals of haute cuisine feel increasingly antiquated. Voisin, once a crown jewel of New York fine dining, began to seem like a relic from another time. Its eventual closure marked the end of an era when French dining reigned supreme in Manhattan, replaced by a wave of new restaurants that embraced eclecticism and accessibility. Today, Voisin is remembered less as a place you simply ate and more as a place you experienced. It was a sanctuary of civility and luxury, a dining room where time slowed down, and every course reinforced the idea that fine dining was as much performance as it was pleasure. Quo Vadis, New York City. In the glittering world of New York's 1970s dining scene, Quo Vadis was a stage where power, elegance, and European refinement converged. Located on East 63rd Street, this Italian-French restaurant wasn't merely a place to eat. It was where Wall Street titans, publishing moguls, and celebrities gathered under crystal chandeliers and velvet banquettes to seal deals, see and be seen, and indulge in a performance of fine dining. Its very name, Latin for "where are you going?" seemed to whisper the answer. If you were anybody in New York society, you were going to Quo Vadis. The dining room was lavish, with decor that evoked the grandeur of old Europe. Gilded mirrors, richly upholstered seating, and service executed with near military precision. The menu balanced French sophistication with Italian flair, presenting dishes like lobster ravioli in cream sauce, veal scallopini, and impeccably roasted game. Trolley service was a highlight. Tableside preparations of Caesar salads, flambéed crepes, and carved meats gave meals the air of spectacle. For dessert, a souffle, or zabaglione sealed the memory of a night steeped in opulence. Quo Vadis thrived in an age when dining out was as much about prestige as pleasure. Yet, as the decade progressed, the winds of culinary fashion shifted. Younger diners looked toward more relaxed, adventurous spots, while French-Italian formality began to feel staid. The restaurant's eventual decline mirrored the fading dominance of European haute cuisine in New York, as a new generation of chefs and restaurateurs pushed American dining in daring directions. Today, Quo Vadis exists only in memory and in the stories of those who dined beneath its glittering lights. It represents an era when a night out was theater, when fine dining meant tuxedoed waiters and grand gestures, and when the question Quo Vadis had only one true answer, straight into the heart of New York high society: Luchow's New York City. Few restaurants in New York carried the same old world weight as Luchow's, the storied German-American establishment that, even into the 1970s, remained a beloved institution on East 14th Street. Founded in the 19th century, Luchow's had weathered generations of change in the city, offering its patrons hearty Teutonic feasts and the kind of Gemütlichkeit, warmth, and conviviality that made it as much a gathering place as a restaurant. By the time the disco decade rolled around, it was already considered a landmark, a living reminder of an older beer hall New York where Oompa bands filled the air. The menu was unapologetically German, a rarity in a city increasingly obsessed with French refinement and new global flavors. Sauerbraten, Wiener Schnitzel, Knockwurst, and potato pancakes came out in generous portions, often accompanied by rivers of beer and, for the more ambitious, a glass of schnapps. Holidays at Luchow's were legendary, especially Oktoberfest and Christmas, when the dining rooms glittered with lights and wreaths, and carolers filled the space with festive song. For many New Yorkers, it was a place to celebrate milestones, to taste tradition, and to enjoy a kind of dining that felt both grand and comfortingly familiar. Yet by the 1970s, the tides of dining culture had begun to shift away from the heavy meat and potato style that Luchow's represented. Younger diners flocked to lighter cuisines and trendier spots downtown, while the East 14th Street location, once bustling, began to feel like it was stranded in a different era. Despite its reputation and its fiercely loyal regulars, the decline was inevitable. When Luchow's finally closed its doors, it wasn't just the end of a restaurant, it was the end of an epoch. For generations, Luchow's had been woven into the fabric of New York life, a place where old world traditions met new world ambition. Today, it is remembered with nostalgia as one of those rare institutions where history, culture, and cuisine came together to create something larger than life. The Rainbow Room, New York City. Perched high atop Rockefeller Center, the Rainbow Room was not just a restaurant, it was a crown jewel in New York City's glittering skyline. By the 1970s, it had already cemented itself as one of the most glamorous dining destinations in America, a place where the city's elite gathered to dine, dance, and drink, with the twinkling lights of Manhattan spread out below. With its Art Deco elegance, revolving dance floor, and panoramic views, it was more than a meal, it was an event. For those lucky enough to secure a reservation, the experience was akin to stepping into a dreamscape where romance and sophistication reigned supreme. The cuisine matched the setting, offering refined dishes that spoke the language of continental luxury. Lobster, filet mignon, oysters, and elegant soufflés were prepared with precision, while champagne and cocktails flowed freely. But food was only part of the story. The Rainbow Room's true power lay in atmosphere. Diners twirled across the gleaming floor to live orchestras, the music carrying them into the early hours of the morning. Proposals, business deals, and milestone celebrations all all seemed somehow grander when accompanied by the glitter of chandeliers and a backdrop of the Empire State Building lit against the night sky. By the late 1970s, however, shifts in the city's cultural and economic landscape began to dim the luster of such grand establishments. Dining trends moved toward informality, experimentation, and global influences, while the Rainbow Room's old-school elegance began to feel like a relic from a more rigid age. Yet even in decline, its legend endured. Though it has seen closures, reopenings, and reinventions over the decades, the Rainbow Room of the 1970s is remembered as the epitome of New York sophistication, a space where dining transcended the ordinary, where music and magic met on a revolving floor, and where every night felt touched by starlight. Jimmy's, Aspen. In the 1970s, as Aspen transformed from a quiet mountain town into a playground for the wealthy, the famous, and the ski-obsessed, Jimmy's carved out its reputation as one of the town's most beloved gathering spots. While the restaurant leaned upscale, it never lost its approachable, convivial spirit, a balance that made it a magnet for celebrities, ski bums, and locals alike. Aspen in those years was a swirl of après-ski glamour, where fur coats mingled with snow-dusted boots, and Jimmy's was right in the middle of it, offering hearty food, stiff drinks, and the kind of atmosphere that encouraged both celebration and camaraderie. The menu reflected the hearty appetites of those coming off the slopes. Steaks, chops, and prime rib dominated, with rich sides like creamed spinach, baked potatoes, and onion rings that landed at the table in generous portions. There was a no-nonsense, stick-to-your-ribs quality to the cooking, paired with an old-school sense of hospitality. The bar was legendary, serving martinis, Manhattans, and plenty of good whiskey, fuel for long evenings that often carried on past dinner into storytelling and laughter. What made Jimmy's stand out wasn't just the food, but the vibe. It felt like Aspen's living room, a place where movie stars rubbed shoulders with ski instructors, and where the après-ski crowd could count on music, conversation, and a warm welcome. In an era when luxury often meant formality, Jimmy's managed to be both indulgent and relaxed, a kind of alpine supper club with an unpretentious heart. Over time, Aspen's dining scene grew more polished and global, and the cozy, clubby atmosphere that Jimmy's embodied became harder to find. But for those who remember the town in its 1970s heyday, Jimmy's will always be part of Aspen's golden age, a place where snow, steak, and style came together in the glow of mountain nightlife. Scandia, Los Angeles. On the Sunset Strip in the 1970s, few restaurants captured the glitz and sophistication of Hollywood dining quite like Scandia. Opened in the 1950s, it had by the disco decade become one of Los Angeles' most celebrated landmarks, the sort of place where producers, stars, and socialites gathered for long, glamorous evenings. With its sleek Scandinavian-inspired decor, wood paneling, rich fabrics, and an understated elegance, Scandia managed to feel both modern and timeless, a perfect backdrop for deal-making lunches and star-studded dinners. The cuisine leaned toward continental European with a Nordic touch, a rarity in Southern California at the time. Smoked salmon, herring, gravlax, and rich cream sauces shared the menu with French and American classics, creating a dining experience that was indulgent yet distinctively international. Their famed Danish meatballs and tableside Chateaubriand became staples, while the wine cellar boasted a selection that impressed even the most seasoned connoisseurs. For many Angelenos, Scandia was the pinnacle of sophistication, the place you dressed up for, where valet parking and champagne toasts were part of the ritual. But what truly made Scandia legendary was its clientele. From Frank Sinatra to Elizabeth Taylor, it drew Hollywood's brightest lights, cementing its reputation as one of the Strip's ultimate status symbols. Dining at Scandia wasn't just about the food, it was about being part of a scene, surrounded by power and celebrity under warm candlelight. As tastes evolved later in the decade, with California cuisine and more casual casual dining styles gaining traction, Scandia's old-world refinement began to feel like a vestige of another era. By the time it closed, it was remembered not as outdated, but as a classic, an emblem of when Los Angeles dining was as much about glamour as gastronomy. Today, Scandia lives on in memory as a shining symbol of Sunset Strip elegance at its peak. The Pump Room, Chicago. If New York had the Rainbow Room, Chicago had the Pump Room, located in the Ambassador East Hotel. This glamorous dining institution was the Windy City's answer to Hollywood's glittering supper clubs, a place where the 1970s still shimmered with the glamour of an earlier golden age. Since its opening in the late 1930s, the Pump Room had been synonymous with celebrity culture, and by the disco decade, it remained the place to see and be seen. Booth 1, its most famous table, was practically a throne, reserved for visiting royalty, movie stars, and music legends passing through Chicago. The atmosphere was pure elegance, chandeliers, plush banquettes, and tuxedoed waiters delivering the kind of attentive service that turned a meal into theater. The menu, though rooted in continental traditions, evolved to keep up with the times. Classic steaks, roast chicken, and seafood towers stood alongside soufflés and flambéed desserts, often prepared tableside for an added touch of spectacle. Champagne and martinis flowed freely, and the dining room pulsed with the energy of deal-making, gossip, and late-night laughter. What truly defined the Pump Room in the 1970s was its star power. Everyone from Frank Sinatra and Elizabeth Taylor to Mick Jagger and David Bowie dined there, leaving an aura of glamour that few restaurants in Chicago or anywhere could match. For locals, a night at the Pump Room was the ultimate indulgence, a chance to brush shoulders with icons while soaking in the glamour of a cosmopolitan, world-class city. By the late 70s, however, changing dining trends and shifts in hotel culture began to dull its once blinding sparkle. Still, the Pump Room's legacy is indelible. It was more than just a restaurant. It was a stage where Chicago's nightlife played out in full view, a place where luxury and celebrity collided under soft lights, forever etching it into the city's cultural memory. Jilly's, New York City. In the swirl of New York nightlife during the 1970s, Jilly's held a reputation that was equal parts restaurant, lounge, and celebrity clubhouse. Located on West 52nd Street, just steps from Broadway, it was the kind of place where you could drop in for a steak and end up sharing a drink with Frank Sinatra, or at least with someone from his orbit. Jilly Rizzo, the restaurant's namesake and Sinatra's close friend, presided over the place with a mix of charm and bravado, giving Jilly's an aura that was both intimate and larger than life. The menu leaned toward hearty Italian-American fare, veal parmigiana, spaghetti with red sauce, sizzling steaks, dishes designed for comfort and indulgence rather than haute cuisine. The bar was always well stocked, the martinis were poured with a heavy hand, and the atmosphere encouraged lingering into the late hours. For many, Jilly's wasn't just about eating, it was about being part of a circle, a space where showbiz figures, mobsters, and New York high rollers all seemed to brush elbows in the glow of dim lighting and cigarette smoke. What set Jilly's apart was its vibe. Unlike the formality of Manhattan's French dining temples or the glitz of supper clubs, it felt like a den of camaraderie, a place where the night stretched endlessly and where every table carried the weight of stories whispered and deals sealed. Sinatra's frequent presence only added to the mystique. When Old Blue Eyes made Jilly's his unofficial headquarters, the restaurant instantly became a legend. By the end of the 1970s, however, New York's dining and nightlife scenes were changing, and Jilly's eventually faded. Yet for those who passed through its doors, it remains frozen in memory as one of the quintessential Rat Pack era haunts that lingered into the disco decade. A place where pasta, cocktails, and celebrity swagger created an atmosphere no other restaurant could quite replicate. Romanoff's, Beverly Hills. By the 1970s, Romanoff's in Beverly Hills was already the stuff of Hollywood legend. Founded in the 1940s by Michael Romanoff, an eccentric restaurateur who famously styled himself as Russian royalty. This was once the power table for the film industry's elite. During its heyday, it rivaled any spot in New York or Paris for sheer star wattage, with Cary Grant, Humphrey Bogart, and Marilyn Monroe all frequenting its plush dining rooms. But even as the decades rolled on, Romanoff's held on to its aura of old Hollywood glamour, making it a symbol of Beverly Hills sophistication well into the disco decade. The restaurant's interiors were elegant without being gaudy. Deep banquettes, dark wood, and white tablecloths that carried a certain unspoken gravitas. The menu leaned classic continental, a mix of French and American dishes that reflected the tastes of its clientele. Oysters Rockefeller, roast duck, steaks carved tableside, and desserts prepared with a flourish. The service was impeccable, delivered with an old-world polish that made everyone, whether a studio mogul or a first-time visitor, feel like royalty. What truly defined Romanoff's, however, was the crowd. To dine there meant to be part of Hollywood's inner circle, to sit just a few tables away from Sinatra, Elizabeth Taylor, or a Paramount executive signing a deal. It was both stage and sanctuary, where gossip flowed as freely as champagne, and reputations were made or broken over a long lunch. By the 1970s, though, the tides of Los Angeles dining were shifting. Trendier spots like Ma Maison and Scandia began to steal the limelight, catering to a younger generation of stars and executives. Romanoff's, with its old-world formality, started to feel like a relic of an earlier, glossier Hollywood. When it finally closed, it marked the end of an era. Still, Romanoff's remains legendary, remembered as the quintessential Hollywood power restaurant, where every meal was a scene and every table a story. La Côte Basque, New York City. For decades, La Côte Basque stood as one of Manhattan's most elegant dining rooms, and by the 1970s, it still epitomized French refinement at its most polished. Located on West 55th Street, it was the kind of restaurant where white tablecloths gleamed, chandeliers sparkled, and the hushed air of exclusivity made every guest feel they were part of something rarefied. It was not simply a restaurant, but a social institution where New York's upper crust, socialites, editors, and celebrities came to see and be seen while indulging in the city's most refined French cooking. The menu, firmly rooted in classical tradition, offered a culinary tour of Parisian luxury. Dover sole was filleted tableside with practiced ease. Lobster thermidor arrived in its shell, and quenelles of pike floated in delicate sauce. Rich pâtés, terrines, and foie gras appeared with stately regularity, paired with wines from one of the most respected cellars in the city. Dessert was no afterthought. Soufflés, delicate tarts, and profiteroles punctuated evenings that felt more performance than meal. But La Côte Basque was as much about theater as it was about taste. Waiters in formal attire moved with precision. Conversations hummed in discreet tones, and the sight of a famous author or socialite at the next table was almost expected. It was immortalized in gossip columns and fiction alike, famously serving as the setting for Truman Capote's thinly veiled tell-all stories in Answered Prayers, which both scandalized and cemented the restaurant's place in cultural lore. By the late 1970s, however, the winds of change were blowing. Dining trends shifted toward informality, with younger New Yorkers seeking bolder, more global flavors. La Côte Basque, with its strict dress codes and rigid rituals, began to feel like an emblem of another age. Yet its closure did not erase its significance. at its peak, a place where fine dining and social theater were inseparable. Ernie's, San Francisco. In the 1970s, when San Francisco was cementing its reputation as a city of culinary innovation, Ernie's stood apart as a shrine to old-world glamour. Tucked away on Montgomery Street, this legendary French restaurant had been dazzling diners since the late 19th century, and by the disco decade, it was still serving as the city's ultimate stage for elegant evenings. Walking into Ernie's felt less like entering a restaurant and more like stepping onto a movie set. No accident, since Alfred Hitchcock famously used it in Vertigo, forever linking it to cinematic allure. The decor was unapologetically opulent. Red velvet walls, gilt mirrors, crystal chandeliers, and polished brass that made the dining room shimmer in a perpetual twilight glow. Patrons were expected to dress the part, suits and gowns, not jeans and sneakers. And the ritual of dining there carried with it a sense of occasion. Ernie's was a place for anniversaries, business triumphs, or simply for anyone who wanted to brush against San Francisco's high society. The menu reflected the best of French haute cuisine. Tables groaned under rich offerings like Chateaubriand for two, duck à l'orange, and Dover sola, all served with sauces that spoke of painstaking classical technique. Dishes were often finished tableside, adding an air of theater to the meal. The wine cellar was among the city's finest, and desserts, soufflés, cherries jubilee, crepe Suzette, provided a flamboyant finale. By the 1970s, however, Ernie's was increasingly viewed as a relic of an earlier dining era, while Nouvelle cuisine and California cooking began emphasizing freshness, simplicity, and local ingredients. Ernie's clung proudly to its butter, cream, and ritual. To some, this made it old-fashioned. To others, it made it timeless. When Ernie's finally closed in the 1990s, it left behind not just a restaurant, but a piece of San Francisco's cultural identity. In the 1970s, it remained a bastion of continental elegance, a place where velvet, candlelight, and classic French flavors created an unforgettable dining experience. Windows on the World, New York City. Perched atop the North Tower of the World Trade Center, Windows on the World was the restaurant that quite literally put dining on a new level, 107 stories above Manhattan. When it opened in 1976, it instantly redefined what a destination restaurant could be, pairing haute cuisine with sweeping cinematic views that stretched from the Statue of Liberty to the glittering bridges of Brooklyn. To step into Windows on the World was to step into the future of dining, modern, ambitious, and audaciously glamorous. The decor was sleek and contemporary, designed to complement the breathtaking skyline rather than compete with it. By day, sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, and by night, the city lights twinkled like a jeweled carpet below. Guests didn't just dine here, they ascended into an experience that bordered on the surreal, suspended between sky and city. The menu was equally ambitious. Executive chef Joe Baum, already a legend for his work on the Four Seasons, crafted a dining program that celebrated modern American cuisine while borrowing from global traditions. Lobster Newburg, rack of lamb, and delicately prepared seafood stood alongside seasonal vegetables and carefully curated wine pairings. Businessmen, celebrities, and international visitors all flocked to Windows, not just for the food, but for the sense of prestige that came with dining in the clouds. In the cultural fabric of 1970s New York, Windows on the World symbolized optimism. At a time when the city faced financial crises and social upheaval, the restaurant projected confidence and possibility. It was a place where anniversaries, corporate victories, and special nights out became unforgettable, not least because the view itself was impossible to replicate. Though tragically lost in 2001, Windows on the World endures in memory as one of the greatest restaurants ever to grace New York. In the 1970s, it wasn't just a dining room, it was a vision of the city's future, shimmering above the clouds, where luxury and wonder shared the same table. Chasen's, Los Angeles. For much of the 20th century, Chasen's was the crown jewel of Hollywood Hollywood dining. And even by the 1970s, its legend showed no signs of fading. Located on Beverly Boulevard, this was the restaurant where movie stars, studio heads, and politicians alike gathered, creating a dining room that often felt more like an Academy Awards after party than a neighborhood establishment. Its paneled walls, red leather booths, and hushed lighting set the stage for countless deals, romances, and whispered gossip that shaped Hollywood history. The menu was unapologetically American with a touch of indulgence. Steaks, prime rib, and chicken pot pie were staples, but the restaurant's most famous dish was undoubtedly its chili, so iconic that Elizabeth Taylor once had it flown to Rome during the filming of Cleopatra. The appeal of Chasen's wasn't about culinary innovation so much as comfort elevated to luxury, delivered with an air of exclusivity that made every table feel like the best in the house. What truly made Chasen's magical was its clientele. Richard Burton and Liz Taylor, Ronald Reagan and Nancy Davis, later Reagan, Cary Grant, Frank Sinatra, and a rotating roster of Hollywood royalty turned its booths into their personal clubs. Booth number 2, in particular, was a power spot where history was made as much as dinner was eaten. The service was discreet, the atmosphere was plush, and the idea of being seen there carried as much weight as the food itself. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, however, the tides of Los Angeles dining began to shift. Trendier, more experimental restaurants like Ma Maison began to capture the attention of younger Hollywood, leaving Chasen's as a monument to a bygone age of glamour. Yet its reputation as the Hollywood restaurant never truly faded. Today, even though the doors have long since closed, Chasen's lives on in legend as the place where the golden age of Hollywood dined, laughed, and clinked martini glasses under soft lights and leather booths. The Brown Derby, Hollywood. Few restaurants are as entwined with Hollywood mythology as the Brown Derby. By the 1970s, its signature hat-shaped building had already become a landmark, instantly recognizable even to those who never stepped inside. Opened in 1926, the original Derby sat just off Wilshire Boulevard before expanding into several locations, including the famed Hollywood branch on Vine Street. For decades, it wasn't just a place to eat. It was the stage where stars dined, discovered, and sometimes even made. The Brown Derby's menu was deceptively simple, but behind its unassuming offerings lay some of the most enduring dishes in American dining. The Cobb salad was invented here, a chopped medley of greens, bacon, eggs, avocado, and chicken that became as much a Hollywood export as the films themselves. There was also the grapefruit cake, another Derby creation that found its way into cookbooks and home kitchens across the country. For all the flash and celebrity glitz, the food had a homespun accessibility, making it a restaurant that both moguls and moviegoers could appreciate. The Derby was more than its food. It was an institution of networking and showbiz magic. The Hollywood location, especially, became a veritable casting office disguised as a dining room. Agents and producers held court in booths. Deals were struck over lunch, and rising stars angled for a chance to be spotted at the next table. Lucille Ball, Clark Gable, Marlene Dietrich, and countless others made it their haunt, while caricatures of stars lined the walls in an ever-growing gallery of fame. By the 1970s, however, the Derby's luster had begun to dim. Changing tastes, economic pressures, and the decline of old Hollywood glamour chipped away at its relevance. The Hollywood location closed in 1985, though by then it had already secured its place in cultural memory. The Brown Derby wasn't just a restaurant, it was Hollywood's dining room, a place where the Dream Factory went out for dinner, and where a salad could be as legendary as the stars who ate it. Maxime's de Paris, Chicago. In the 1970s, when Chicago wanted to prove it could rival New York or Los Angeles in sophistication, it unveiled something extraordinary, Maxime's de Paris. Modeled after the original Parisian Maxims, the Chicago outpost opened in 1963 beneath the Playboy Mansion, and quickly became one of the city's most glamorous dining rooms. Think Belle Epoque splendor dropped right into the Midwest, a swirl of red velvet banquettes, gilded mirrors, stained glass, and soft lighting that made every meal feel like a scene out of La Boheme. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was Hugh Hefner's statement piece. While the Paris original had been the haunt of aristocrats and artists, Chicago's Maxim's blended old-world European grandeur with a distinctly American flair for spectacle. It became a social playground for celebrities, politicians, and business titans, each of whom could slip into a velvet booth and pretend, if only for a night, that Chicago was the Paris of the Midwest. The menu was pure French luxury. Lobster thermidor, escargot swimming in garlic butter, and Chateaubriand carved tableside reinforced the idea that dining here was theater. Even the cocktails leaned toward extravagance. Champagne flowed with abandon, and martinis arrived perfectly chilled in glassware that caught the glow of the chandeliers. For many Chicagoans, a dinner at Maxim's wasn't simply a meal. It was a rite of passage, a way of declaring you had arrived. But just like its Parisian counterpart, Maxim's in Chicago catered to a very specific version of glamour, one rooted in exclusivity, elegance, and the illusion of timeless indulgence. By the late 1970s and 1980s, as dining culture shifted toward modernity and lighter fare, the heavy opulence of Maxim's began to feel like a relic. Eventually, it closed, but the memory of its velvet-draped dining rooms lingers. For those who passed through its doors, Maxim's de Paris wasn't just dinner in Chicago. It was Paris by way of Playboy, a fleeting dream of elegance in the heart of the Midwest. Trader Vic's. If the 1970s had a soundtrack of disco and a wardrobe of polyester, then Trader Vic's was its tiki-soaked dining room. Born out of Victor Trader Vic Bergeron's vision of Polynesian escapism, Trader Vic's wasn't just a restaurant, it was a full-blown fantasy. By the time the decade rolled around, its locations had spread across the globe, with outposts in major cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Each was a tropical refuge from urban life, where bamboo walls, carved tikis, and dimly lit lanterns promised a quick passport to the South Seas. No boarding pass required. The food was a playful fusion long before fusion cuisine became a buzzword. Diners dug into dishes like crab rangoon, Chinese-style spare ribs, and curried shrimp, all paired with flaming poo-poo platters that doubled as both appetizer and performance. The cocktails, however, were the real stars. Trader Vic's famously popularized the Mai Tai, a concoction of rum, lime, and orgeat that came to define tiki culture. Drinks were served in whimsical mugs shaped like coconuts, skulls, or hula girls, often arriving with enough rum to make even the most stoic businessman loosen his tie. In the 1970s, a night at Trader Vic's felt like the ultimate indulgence. Movie stars and socialites flocked to its locations, but so did everyday diners eager to sip something exotic and escape the grind of city life. It was glamorous kitsch at its finest, equal parts sophisticated and silly, with the magic lying in that balance. Of course, as the decades wore on, tastes shifted. The rise of health-conscious dining and sleeker, more modern restaurants made the tiki aesthetic feel dated. Many Trader Vic's closed their doors, though a few stubbornly remained, carrying the torch of rum-soaked nostalgia. Looking back, Trader Vic's in the 1970s was more than a restaurant. It was an era distilled in a glass, escapist, theatrical, and just a little bit wild. Proof that sometimes the best luxury is pretending you're on an island, even if you're really in downtown Chicago. The Four Seasons, New York City. When the Four Seasons opened in 1959 inside the Seagram building, it didn't just raise the bar for fine dining in New York, it shattered it. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the restaurant had become one of the most important dining rooms in America, a temple of modernist luxury that combined cutting-edge design with impeccable cuisine. Stepping into the Four Seasons in its prime prime was less like entering a restaurant and more like entering a living museum of style, where the act of dining was elevated to high culture. The space itself was revolutionary. Designed by architect Philip Johnson and interior designer Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, the restaurant was split into the grill room and the pool room, each an architectural marvel. The pool room, with its centerpiece, a shimmering pool of water surrounded by white flowering trees, was especially iconic, creating an atmosphere that was serene, dramatic, and utterly unlike anything else in the city. This was the backdrop against which power lunches were invented, where Wall Street titans, publishing magnates, and celebrities alike gathered to eat, scheme, and be seen. The menu reflected a new kind of American luxury. Seasonal ingredients were the focus, an innovation at the time that has since become a given in modern cuisine. Poached fish, delicately prepared meats, and fresh vegetables were plated with a restraint that let the quality speak for itself. It wasn't fussy French dining, nor was it casual American fare. It was something new, a cuisine that reflected both modern elegance and cultural ambition. In the 1970s, the Four Seasons was the place where reputations were made, deals were sealed, and style was as much a part of the meal as the food itself. Everyone from Jackie Kennedy to Henry Kissinger graced its tables, ensuring the restaurant's reputation as a meeting ground of influence. Though it would eventually close in 2019, its impact is permanent. The Four Seasons wasn't just a restaurant, it was a stage for New York's theater of power, prestige, and taste, embodying the very idea of dining as art. And there you have it, 30 of the most glamorous, unforgettable restaurants of the 1970s, each gone but never forgotten. From Hollywood hotspots to New York power dining rooms, these places remind us of a time when eating out was pure theater. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, don't forget to hit like, share it with a fellow foodie, and subscribe for more journeys into the golden age of dining. What was your favorite long-lost restaurant? Let us know in the